coach.
One of many coaches.
My sound may come on.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, but here it is.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that'd be awesome.
I don't know how to reach you.
Gotcha.
So maybe
You're not big on the Facebook stuff, huh? Well, the team's got a page.
oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's like that whole mountain.
So cool, that's
Yeah.
I'm not
No,
ready.
I just sent her an email as well, but she,
Not ready. Was there an updated draft to look at, or?
He didn't come.
yeah, she hasn't come in.
Wait, I didn't get a, shoot,
I think about 4 days ago.
I've been,
All she did is
Shoot.
she updated the spreadsheet.
I left my laptop at home. Well, I guess I'll just catch up as we go.
Or somebody else who said they aren't arguing.
Yeah.
No.
Maybe I'll see if I can get a copy.
Maybe they'll be in it.
Because, gosh, I've been looking for it. I might have missed it, but I don't.
Send it to you again.
Would you mind?
another
Yeah,
couple.
thank you. It's probably just got put in a weird place in my inbox or something.
You got the folders if you want to brew some up.
There's also the Cafe Bustelo. Unless that's out. Oh, right here.
Oh, this is the Ebike.
I was actually going to have you drive again, if you don't mind.
Is this me? Or is this you? Who's doing this? Am I chairing this? I guess that's what I was asking. Who's the minute taker? I guess you're doing this, so you're not taking minutes.
I think Zach and I could probably lead this through.
Okay.
We've got one commissioner who's not going to be
Okay.
quick and busy making it.
And
Oh, thanks.
one commissioner will be
Thanks,
late.
Gert.
At least one commissioner.
So we. Oh, sweet. Yeah. Shall we? Good morning. The time is now 10:01. I'd like to call to order this special joint meeting with the Planning Commission and Board of Equalization meeting and the Grand County Council. It's 10:01, October 29th, 2019. I'll let everyone introduce themselves. Those present, Evan Clapper, Chair of the County Council. Sure.
Jaylen Hawks, County Council.
Terry Morris, County Council.
Kevin Walker, Planning Commission.
Abby Scott, Planning Commission.
Bob O'Brien, Planning Commission.
Garish Willis, Chair of the Planning Commission.
Greg Halliday, Grand County Council.
Zachariah Levine, Community and Economic Development Director.
Neela Denver-Irwin, Community and Economic Development Specialist.
Great, and the first item on our agenda today is a discussion item, a workshop with the Planning Commission on new overnight accommodations development standards. Zachariah, you want to walk us through this?
Sure. So this is a continuation of our last meeting. If you remember, we met together on the 2nd of October to begin reviewing draft standards for new overnight accommodations. And based on that conversation, as well as two subsequent conversations between staff and the Planning Commission, as well as a few subsequent conversations between county staff and city staff, we have come back to you now with an updated table cataloging the standards that we have come up with to date in the 5 key areas that we've been working on So that would be energy, water, transportation, mixed-use standards, and form-based or design standards. So what I would like to do today is try to stay really focused and go through the standards that we have to date, because we are at the point in the process where staff needs to begin writing code in preparation for public hearings at the Planning Commission and County Council in order to meet the county's self-imposed deadline of January 14th, 2020 for adopting new standards. We again have our spreadsheet up on the screen that we have been using for cataloging our standards. I have 11 by 17 versions as well, if it would be easier for folks to follow on that. I could probably have a few of these copied, or have these copied. Okay.
Do you have the maps in 11 by 17?
I don't, and those, we're going to only slightly reference those a little later, and we'll see how much time we have left when we get to that exercise. Let's see, so are the screens not going to work for folks? Okay. Okay, cool. I've got one hard copy here if somebody really wants
Just
it.
like to,
Sure.
I printed it, but then I forgot to pick it up.
Yeah. Okay, so we've been spending a lot of time talking about energy, water, and transportation, and a little less time on form-based standards and mixed-use standards. So what I'm going to propose is that we go in reverse order so that we make sure that we get everything, because I think that there's a fair amount of consensus on the energy and water standards to date, and I want to make sure that we touch on the standards that have received less attention. Okay? So in that regard, I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom of the chart and start with balconies. Sure.
Let me just quickly ask, in the online packet, it looked like there were two sets of the same thing.
Yeah, they're the same thing. I don't know how that happened. Yeah, I think I sent Bryony a version of it in Word and then the Excel file as well, so they are the same thing.
They were a little different. I noticed a couple of discrepancies.
Quit reading to make sure.
Really? Well, I've got the Excel table up on both screens, and so these are going to be the most up-to-date. Based on the Planning Commission's discussions, there is no interest in regulating balconies, and so that's why all of these are crossed out. So what I'm going to do, like we did at the last meeting, is kind of just do a straw poll with the county council in particular, and make sure that at least those who are here are comfortable with the direction that things are going, so that again there's a record of straw poll votes. Okay, so can I see a show of hands from council members who are comfortable with striking standards associated with balconies? Okay, so 3, 4, and against. Are you against striking that?
Yeah, I am.
Do you want to communicate your position?
You want an opinion on it? Well, I think it's an added feature that can be added to any form-based architectural plan that, I'm not so sure that it needs to be required. However, I do think that it should be something that considered to break up the facade of massive buildings. And obviously we've all seen it all over the world, and it does make a difference.
So Terry, just to be clear, I think what was on the books before was prohibiting balconies. And then the proposal is to just not say anything about them, so they're allowed, they're not required, but they're not prohibited either. So we were moving from prohibiting to no regulation.
So the proposed standards were balconies should be a minimum of 6 feet deep and 5 feet wide. Balconies that are not integral to the facade should be independently secured and connected. And a maximum of 40% of the front and corner facades, as calculated separately, may be covered with balconies, including street-facing railing and balcony structures.
Okay.
And I agree with your assessment of their architectural value and even functionality. I think what the Planning Commission is saying is we don't need to regulate them. People will put them in, people won't put them in, and we have other standards that ensure that we don't have too much of a blank wall, or too much of just like a long, unbroken facade.
Yeah,
So-
then I'm fine with it. I
Okay.
just didn't realize we were going from, one side to the other side. I thought we were,
Okay.
And just to
I
clarify,
just based my opinion on
Yeah.
the chart.
So, for the record, then I've got Jalen, Greg, Evan, and now Terry supportive of striking balcony standards from our set of form-based standards. Moving up the table, then interior lighting. So this is a new standard that perhaps the county council members haven't seen yet. And this is a standard that would say interior lighting located in rooms with windows visible from any property line boundary shall have their fixtures directed to the interior of the room so as to minimize light pollution. So we have new outdoor lighting standards. We don't have anything that contemplates the effects of indoor lighting on outdoor space. So, is everybody kind of clear on what
Yeah.
is being depicted here?
Are you seeing other locations that are utilizing standards like this?
Well, I actually just presented on dark skies and outdoor lighting at two separate professional meetings, one at the Colorado Association of Ski Towns and one at the Mountain and Resort Town Planners Summit. And I had at each about half a dozen communities come up and ask specifically about whether or not we were doing anything about the effects of indoor lighting. And one that comes to mind is Telluride. So they regulate indoor lighting because they have a lot of houses that are on hillsides. And if you are lower than the hillside and you're looking up at somebody's 20-foot span of glass, and they've got chandeliers galore, then it creates an impact, right? So I wouldn't say that we have anything currently that's that excessive, but certainly there are hotels in our community that if you had 20 rooms on the front facade, all with their windows open and their lights on at night, it's going to have an impact.
There's other towns that have things on the books that address interior lighting.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a lantern effect that we're
Right.
trying to avoid, and apparently there are a couple buildings in town that people are sensitive about. I guess the Sunset Grill, and then there's another one. Our planning commission mentioned it. So, anyway.
But for a developer, this isn't necessarily coming out of left field, is what I was thinking. Like,
I mean, it would be a new level, like a heightened level of scrutiny.
for here.
Yeah,
But
for
if-
here.
If they have worked in Park City or things like that, they might have dealt with this before.
Perhaps, yeah.
Architects they're working with, it wouldn't be a foreign
Yeah,
concept.
perhaps.
Okay.
Perhaps.
I like it.
And I think this is one that, if nothing else, is aspirational and suggestive. I mean, certainly we want to try to enforce our codes as much as possible, but if we were to miss one, or a light fixture gets, miss one during plan review, or a light fixture gets changed, it just gives us some cover for then contacting, a lodging establishment and saying, we've received a complaint, we have this basis in our code for requiring you to direct your lighting towards the interior of a room that faces, the property boundary. Would you go and update that?
That's a question here. Sure. I've never seen lighting on the inside of a room that was directed to the outside of the room. I've never seen.
Lucky you.
I mean, I haven't. So I'm not sure what you're talking about. Are you talking about spotlights that are directed at the inside of the windows so they shine out?
That possibly, or just excessive indoor lighting that emanates towards the outside of a building, just because it was, placed either carelessly or without consideration of its impact on the exterior.
How do you evaluate whether it's successful?
Well, I'm just using that subjective term right now, but what I'm saying is if there are lighting fixtures, let's say they're, I don't know what kind of lighting fixture it would be, but it was pointing towards the exterior window of a room, and that's going to have a greater effect on the out space around it. It's going to have more light pollution or create more light pollution than a fixture that's pointing towards the interior of the building.
Correct.
So I think
I've just
one
never
scenario
seen
that's,
it pointed out.
so I might be guilty of doing this in my house. I mean, when you've got track lighting, you have lots of little small spotlights and they're pointed lots of different directions. And some of those could be pointed at a window and, in your neighbor's face, and you wouldn't know it, or just by accident, 'cause- so.
I don't know if we need
Well, if
an
you,
ordinance for that.
I don't know that we do either, but I can tell you that if you go up on any ridge lines at night and look down at Moab, it's clear that you can see the difference between indoor lighting that is bleeding out and indoor lighting that is, focused inward. It's just as plain as day.
But how can you tell whether or not that's the lighting or it's a drapery or something like that that's mitigating the light?
Well, it's pretty easy when you drive by.
Okay, I've just never seen it.
Yeah, well, what I would suggest on that is, I don't, I'm a little bit ambivalent to require, everybody to have a certain fixture that has a shade on the front next to a window, and then come in. But on the other hand, I do think if you're going to be an advocate of dark skies, then you really need to look at it seriously, because most of the light pollution that I see in the ridge lines now are lightings that are either on the exterior of the house or in the interior coming out. And there is a ton of it, both in the commercial and in the residential aspects of development in the valley.
And I'd say that my house is guilty of it. It's a funny thing. We have a bowl-shaped light, but it's down below where the windows are, and we can see it pretty far away. And I can imagine some kind of ordinance that said, well, the same as you're not supposed to let light go off your property, that you'd have some kind of shading on it so that it might pass through the window but wouldn't go off the property, which would be the same as for exterior lighting.
We did a remodel last spring and made it so that we had sliding glass windows that went into our backyard. And prior to making that, one of the things we enjoyed doing in the summer was laying in the backyard and looking for shooting stars. We created that window, and because of the type of lights that were in there before that, we ended up changing the lighting because it was interfering with our ability to see the night sky. And it was, and it was a simple fix. It was a simple fix. But a lot of people wouldn't even be aware of that unless they were outside in that area. So it is more common than you would think, and it's just being conscious of it and
How far into your backyard did that,
enough
did
to
that
interfere.
cone of light extend?
Enough to interfere with the night sky. We were not able to see the night sky to
Well, I
the
know, but did it extend off your property?
No, but that's because there's nobody that lives behind us.
Yeah.
But if we had lived in a different area of the town, it would have affected our neighbors.
Another way of approaching this could be to add a transmissivity factor on glass that's appropriate. In the same way that you can buy glass that has lower transmissivity for thermal protection in the summertime, you can have glass that does the same thing all the time for light that emanates from the inside the room.
I understand that, but that's gonna require a lot of money you can put out.
I don't think the glazing cost is that much different, but it's something that we could look into.
No, but I mean, if you're building a new place, it's one thing to put in those kind of windows. It's another thing to retrofit.
Well, I don't think these standards are
These
dealing with
standards
any
for new development.
retrofitting. It's new construction.
These standards are for new development, I think.
And they could come into play when we talk about redevelopment. But just to keep us on track, because I don't want to get us too lost in the weeds of one specific standard. And we'll have more opportunities to, crack this nut. But by a show of hands from county council members who are present, who is supportive of at least continuing to work on a standard related to interior lighting?
Well, again, I like his idea, Parrish's idea, as well to explore, and maybe it could be an either or proposition.
Yeah, I think it's, if the light is coming off your property, then you gotta deal with it. And you can change the fixtures, you can change the glass, you can do whatever, but just keep your light to yourself.
And are you opposed to keeping it in? Okay, so let's go up to window awnings and shutters, okay? So, these are elements of form-based standards that we are looking at. And let me back up a minute. On the spreadsheet, you'll see the development standard category on the left, so balconies, interior lighting, etc. You'll see the standard column to the right of that. That's kind of a general standard column. And then the two columns to the right of that, in columns C and D, you've got them split in some standard categories and together in others. The idea here is that the Planning Commission acknowledged that some standards are appropriate for overnight accommodations developments in some areas, but not in others. Or that we should have different standards based on the location of a particular overnight accommodations development. And so one thing that we are cognizant of is that when we created the high-density housing overlay, we created boundaries or districts where parcels would be eligible for applying for the HDH overlay. We didn't do that for the overnight accommodations overlay. So currently, any parcel in Grand County could come to the county and request that the overlay be attached to them. The Planning Commission and the County Council at the last joint meeting discussed the merits of creating these eligibility districts. And so what you see in this table is kind of the first conceptualization of that. Rather than creating a bunch of different tiers like we did with the high-density housing overlay, to date we have just been talking about the appropriateness of certain standards based on areas that are quote-unquote urbanizing. So these would be area nodes that we anticipate a lot of new development happening or could happen at in the future, places close to city limits. And then a rural area, right? So these are places that are even farther afield from city limits or high development activity nodes. Maybe places in Cisco or Thompson or way south in the valley. Okay, so in these bottom ones, you'll see a lot that these design standards, based on the last conversations with the Planning Commission, would just be the same for both districts, or they would just be eliminated for both districts. As we move up the table, you'll start to see some differentiation between the two different districts. Okay, everybody with me on that concept? Okay.
Zachariah, can you get that screen to mirror this screen?
Yeah, I will. I will try. It's
it gets kind of small, but
Yeah, it gets kind of small, but just for the purposes of,
great.
is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, so going up the table to window, awnings, and shutters. The standard, if installed, shutters, whether functional or not, shall be sized for the windows. If closed, the shutters shall not be too small for complete coverage of the window. Shutters shall be wood. Okay, so this is kind of a basic design element that many communities use to avoid the appearance of, really artificial and kind of stuck on or ticky-tacky type design elements. I don't know that we need to have a lot of discussion on this, so I'm just going to go right ahead and call for a straw poll.
What's the thought of requiring them to be made of wood?
Yeah, I would delete that,
Or
especially in today's world, because
Okay.
there's so many
Other-
different building materials
okay.
and so much being done with glass and steel these days and
Yeah.
so on and so forth. That I think it's
What if we said shutters shall be made of durable materials? Durable primary materials, because you'll see as we go up, there's also reference to durable primary materials.
it's better.
I will say that we used to have at my house vinyl shutters. And in this climate,
Yeah.
they completely melt and deteriorate and look terrible. So I'm with eliminating vinyl and plastic, but I'll go with Perry on the durable.
Okay. So, let's say,
So we're saying that these are not necessarily functional.
if they are not
Decorative.
functional, if they are not, even if they're functional or non-functional, they need to appear as though they are functional, right?
And it's.
They need to
has
fit
do
the,
with-
they need to fit the
Yeah.
facade. They
It's
need to fit the window.
proportionality and,
See, because even wood shutters, unless you maintain them, they're gonna degrade over time. They're gonna warp, the paint's gonna chip off, they're gonna look like crap after a while.
Doesn't sound very durable.
But you would say that about stucco as well. I mean, the reality is
You
that.
say that about any
Any-
material.
yeah,
Oh,
some-
yeah.
Somebody
You
who's
know,
willing to maintain
so-
the outward appearance,
Yeah. I kinda want all of the wood on the exposed to weather. Paint peels off, warps, the whole 9 yards, so, plastic becomes brittle. If you hit it, if something strikes it, it'll chip and break and stuff. But it maintains the facade of functionality longer, I think.
I think you see the fading on plastic easier. I mean, I don't, any material in the sun. Oh, sorry.
The sun just eats stuff up.
Sun just eats stuff up.
No matter what it is, unless it's metal.
So let's say that we change the last sentence to say shutters shall be made of primary durable materials. With that change, show of hands, keeping it in.
Yeah. I can-
Okay.
However, there are some types of synthetic materials that are stabilized for sun exposure.
And we would probably allow, we'll allow for technological improvements. I mean, the goal is not to stymie the building industry. It's to ensure that, we don't have, materials that are going to break down and become either eyesores or liabilities. Okay? So the next standard is, again, plastic or vinyl awnings are not permitted. Awning types and colors for each building face shall be coordinated. Thoughts on that standard?
I think there too, I would support something that said that if it's a synthetic material, it has to be stabilized for exposure to sunlight.
Okay.
I don't know how you'd say that.
So I think that we have that covered in the way that the standard is written right now. The way that the standard is currently written is just that plastic or vinyl awnings are prohibited. So, what you're describing would be allowed.
Sounds good.
I think you need to put something in there about solar stabilized.
Okay? So show of hands for that standard, maintaining this standard that prohibits plastic or vinyl awnings.
There's a chair up by Evan.
Solar stabilized.
Okay. Mary, was your kind of straw poll vote on that to
Oh,
maintain
yes,
the standard, to
yeah.
keep it? Okay.
Thought I raised my hand.
Okay. So, moving up. Okay, so now we're going to be in this box of materials and colors. Okay. Oh, sorry, before we get to that, there was a standard that had been included in this table originally that said that all upper story windows of overnight accommodations, mixed use and associated buildings should be recessed and double hung. In staff's conversation with the Planning Commission on the 8th of October, the Planning Commission determined that they didn't feel the need to regulate that and were comfortable striking it. So, just for the record, I'm going to ask for a straw poll of council members who are comfortable striking that standard. Okay, and Jalen, are you?
I'm mixed. I
You're
could be
mixed,
tucked
okay.
into it. I mean, if the goal is to break up I guess we don't have to say they have to do it. Again, it is a tool to break up the facade of the building.
Right, and you'll see as we go up the table that we have some pretty clear standards on breaking up the facade. But do you?
So I'm fine.
Okay, so you're
Put
okay
me down
with
for
it.
a yes. I just had to
Okay.
think through it out loud.
No problem. Okay, so we're going to go up to materials and colors now. Okay. So the standard for color that the Planning Commission has discussed to date is that OA developments shall utilize earth tone colors that are complementary to the surrounding landscape and visual backdrops. We have references to this type of standard in our code currently. I think that this is vague enough to give developers plenty of flexibility, but also the county enough cover that if somebody wanted to, paint their development, bright lime green or something, we could prohibit it. I struggle with some of the form-based standards, especially with respect to colors, because it is so subjective and because we don't have like a strong color palette already that we're going to maintain. But I think this is a very reasonable standard and one that, frankly, most developers would just be fine with. So, any discussion on this, or should we call for a straw poll?
Do you have something?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, what do we do?
I think that
Color.
I'm ambivalent about the color thing because in certain areas of the community, I think that it's totally appropriate to have colors that may not reflect the, sandstone. I mean, when I first came to Moab, everything was painted sandstone, and it was like somebody came through with a truck of it and gave it away. And I think it's nice to have, especially with personal residences, to have a variety of choices for people. So I just would urge that we not be too tough on that, and have some reasonable room for, especially for residential developments.
So this is, these standards right now are only going to apply to overnight accommodations developments. Now, I think you've raised a good point that a lot of what we've started to work on in here could be translated to new standards for, other forms of development, including residential. Not all of them, but some of them. And I would tend to agree that, we need to be accommodating of a wide color palette. But I also think earth tone is, accommodates a pretty wide palette.
I think it's fine for,
Yeah.
the hotel.
And especially for overnight
kind of
accommodations
thing,
developments.
Does,
Go ahead.
sorry, I was just gonna ask if that was open enough for this recent trend we've seen of breaking up big walls with murals. So like on the Bowen and the car wash.
Good question.
Garage.
Oh, they're nice.
So I don't know if there's
It's a good question.
an art clause or something we could tag in there or something.
Putting on white roofs or light colored roofs, is that considered earth tone? Because I could see some advantages to heating requirements to a light colored roof. You're reflecting more of your solar radiation back into space.
So this is also a way to make sure that the products, the overnight accommodations are customized to our community. So when they come in, they can't necessarily do their blue and, whatever. Their standard colors, they have to really tailor to the community. And that has to do not just with the color, but also sort of some of the architectural features.
And again, for those of you that don't know Nora is the city's planning director and, in my opinion, very welcome to participate in this conversation.
I didn't mean to have the chair at the table. So.
And I'll just share a standard that I've been using personally in going through these as a commissioner, that who will be applying the cost to the community. In the case of single-family homes or individual residences, it's a individual or a family expressing themselves personally. In this case, it would be a developer expressing themselves to a number of visitors, which seems like the cost is imbalanced to me. And the same with the lighting standards. An individual homeowner, I feel like, has a different degree of flexibility in how I would weigh their choices to light their house from the inside than a developer who's imposing a cost across a broader scale of people who aren't members of the community, so the community isn't suffering the cost. So just generally speaking, just to share, that's been a sort of tipping point I've used mentally for myself.
I just wanted to add that, I share some of your skepticism about, regulating appearance too much, and I've lived in Moab a long time, and I've always been comfortable with this kind of funky, junky nature, and I've not been a big proponent of cleaning things up. But if I had to keep, only one standard in this whole long list, it would be the color one, because I think more than these facade things, it definitely affects, the way things look. And I've noted, recent hotels have tended to use earth tones, and it makes a difference. I think they're less obtrusive, and I think that, that just overall color of the building is more important than, size or facade breaking up, all those things. Also want to say, I live in an HOA that has almost an identical color standard. It says use earth tones, and it's a pretty broad thing. I mean, there's a lot of colors that are considered earth tones, and I don't think anyone's complained about having to do that.
Okay, so show of hands, who is supportive of keeping in this standard as written? So I have Jalen, Mary, Greg, 4.
My only thing was the idea of discouraging public art.
So if there's a provision to accommodate public art, you're for it. Okay. Would that hold
I
true
like
for
that, too.
everyone else?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, very much.
So with that provision, requiring earth tone colors with an exception for public art, show of hands in favor.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's everyone.
Thank you, Heather.
I will comment on this. There's a house out in Castle Valley that was painted bright blue. the whole house on the outside. And at first it was kind of startling, but after a while you don't pay attention to it.
But visitors that come to town, that's going to be the first time they see it, so it'll be startling.
Oh, I don't know. I painted my house purple. Came up on Google Maps as the purple house. So, yeah, seriously, for almost a decade,
I
it was a
notice the
landmark.
Sunset Grill every day. I notice
Okay,
the Sunset
so,
Grill every day. I live over by there.
I bet you can find that color.
The battery's off.
I guess that's not color, it's more light, but.
This one, does this work? Mark, can you not hear me, or are you concerned about the YouTubers? Can't hear me? Can someone else try?
1, 2, 3, 4.
Yours isn't on, Zach.
And it's
This-
battery.
Yeah, the battery
Oh.
went out on this one, but,
Mark's not even, you can't even hear this, can you, Mark?
There's only one YouTube watcher, and it's me anyway.
Oh, there's somebody else.
But it is recorded for future.
Right, that's,
We do need another.
it's
You
an
could probably,
archived
probably have this one. 'cause-
document.
yeah,
We're-
okay.
we're-
Yeah.
So,
I haven't actually, let me put this here. Speaking as much.
Nora's going to bring me down the mic, but to save a little time, instead of going through each of the next 4 rows with respect to materials, what I would like to do is just say that the Planning Commission felt comfortable with striking everything with respect to materials except for the following statement. OA developments shall be constructed of durable primary materials such as stone, brick, and adobe type materials, wood lap siding, fiber cement board lapped, shingled or panel, metal siding or glass. Aside from solar panels or other infrastructure related to energy efficiency and water use or reuse, OA developments shall utilize non-reflective materials.
It seems like that would be an appropriate place to also add a clause specific to public art,
Okay?
since that definition is
Sure.
repurposed.
Okay.
Well, I think the planning commission did a good job on that. I'd leave it just like it is.
So to tag on to what Kevin said about Moab being funky and stuff, Moab is also has a lot of very reflective surfaces, lots of roofs that it's not an issue except if you are in an aspect that sees like a roof or a big window, and so and it's really bad. So Greg, I know you're an advocate, you've indicated an advocacy for where it's appropriate white roofs, and I think they're very appropriate from an energy standpoint. If they are visible, or if there is a flat roof that is visible, it should have a parapet or something so that it's not seen outside of, the house is visible but the roof isn't. And sloping roofs, they make some really highly efficient roof materials now that are designed to be extremely reflective from a heat standpoint, but they put out a ton of glare. So that's why I encouraged us to include this non-reflectivity standard.
Okay, so show of hands, or did you want to say something, Jalen?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm hoping that this standard doesn't prohibit, like the synthetic stacked rock look. I hope it's not just only real stone, because there's some very, very attractive buildings that have that stacked synthetic stone rock. Like the panels that are already put together, but
Mm-hmm.
kind that you actually stack and grout and all that. I hope it doesn't prohibit.
I think that would be, from my perspective, at least in the county, that would be perfectly acceptable. Yeah. Okay, so as written, show of hands supportive of this standard regarding materials and essentially striking everything else in the table.
As written by the planning commission recommendation?
As written in the
Oh.
table.
Okay.
red
Yeah,
section?
the red text, yep. So OA developments shall be constructed of durable primary materials such as stone, brick, and adobe-type materials with lap siding, fiber cement board, lab shingled or paneled, metal siding or glass. Aside from solar panels or other infrastructure related to energy efficiency and water use reuse, OA developments shall utilize non-reflective materials.
Question, are those synthetic stone that Jalen was talking about, does that fall into adobe-type materials?
It's a concrete product, it's called engineered stone, so you could just add that.
Okay? Add engineered stone, and then also the public art exception. We'll figure out how to work that in.
Yeah, because I don't think we want to limit this to real stone,
Yeah.
Now,
'cause that gets really expensive.
That's really heavy.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues with this.
Okay, so show of hands, who is in favor of that?
Adding that, what Rebecca said?
Of keeping it as written, adding engineered stone,
Oh,
Yes.
and art.
and the public art exception. Okay, so show of hands.
I was out of the room and missed the discussion on what was being striked, but I like what's in red.
Okay, so just proposing, we didn't actually talk about what was being
Okay.
striked, in favor of just keeping what was in red. Okay, so all in favor of that. Okay, moving right along. Okay, so the next category of standards relate to building design. Okay, you're going to start to see some differentiation between the conceptualized OAO districts. So again, we're going to keep going from bottom to top. So the standard that we're going to talk about right now was originally written as the treatment of roofs should be thoughtful and consistent. Air conditioning units and similar mechanical requirements should be avoided on rooftop locations and fully screened from view when unavoidable. When avoidable, I think is what it should say. Rooftop parking shall be prohibited. So what you'll see here is that we struck the, kind of vague and imprecise statement of the treatment of roofs should be thoughtful and consistent, and maintained the requirement that, mechanical equipment just be shielded from view when possible, even if it's on a roof, yeah.
Zachariah, at one time I thought the standard included if rooftops parking is allowed, there'll be a parapet wall of some sort that would shield the vehicles from street view or something along those lines. And I don't see that in this.
Okay. So any thoughts on that change, that rooftop parking would be permissible as long as it was shielded from view at the street level?
Well, you're going to have some kind of wall around it
Right.
anyway, to keep them
But some of
from
them
driving.
are.
Well, right, but sometimes that would just be
Like a barricade, like a.
yeah, like some cords, some steel pipes and wires between them, right, which wouldn't be shielded.
Yeah, I think it's better to have a concrete
Okay.
wall.
Well, I think the question is, should rooftop parking be disallowed or allowed? And if it is allowed, then what requirements would there be for it?
There's that, it's on that right column in the comments column,
Yes.
and I don't, if putting cars on the roof is gonna make a project pencil out.
It's pretty expensive to park cars on top of a roof. So that's why, it doesn't give me too much heartburn one way or the other. I doubt that too many people, at least in the near term, we will reach a point probably where land values are so high that, and parking, is a real cost to development, that it might actually pencil. But in today's market, I'm not that concerned that people are going to be doing it.
Yeah, we're only talking about 3 stories, too.
maybe not. We'll be talking about that in a little bit.
Right, but we got a current housing project that's held up because of parking, so I'm okay with being creative over parking requirements.
Okay, so allowing it on the roof as long as it's shielded.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So,
And can we add language about that parapet or shielding has to be integrated into the overall design of the structure? So it doesn't look like Jersey barriers on top of the building?
yeah. Okay. So, we may not have the exact language right now, so I'm just going to call for a general straw poll vote for prohibiting mechanical equipment on the roof. When it's unavoidable, it's shielded. Allowing rooftop parking as long as it's shielded, and the shielding for any of this stuff has to be integrated into the overall design of the buildings. All in favor of that type of standard from the county council.
So I think prohibiting is a little bit strong, because a lot of commercial buildings, I mean, that's the only place they can put the mechanical.
So it says fully screened when unavoidable.
Yeah,
Would you say encourage?
Yeah.
It's not as strong of a word. I think maybe something in between
Well, as it's written here, it says should be avoided.
should be
So
avoided,
it
yeah.
doesn't use the word prohibit.
Okay, yeah, so I didn't read that correctly.
All right, well. yeah.
Should be avoided.
I don't mean
Okay.
those words, but-
Yeah, no, I agree that it's,
Personally, I don't really care what's on.
As long as it's shielded.
Well, even that, I'm not, I mean, you're always looking up at a building, usually. You're not seeing what's on the roof unless you're higher than the building.
Or farther
Further
away.
away.
But then what does it matter? I mean,
So, can I just get again who is in favor of that standard, keeping that standard, and who's opposed? Okay, so in favor, Evan, Mary,
Now you're saying
Terry,
that you,
Mary, and Greg.
parking on the roof, if it's shielded and blends into the building, correct?
Mhm.
Is that what we're
Correct.
voting on? Yes, I'm okay with that.
if you're parking on a roof and you're building a parking garage, you just happen to limit the lower floors.
Couldn't look fine on a piece of land being under the circulation.
Okay. So moving up the table, we had a standard that said a mix of entrance types may be utilized aligned with the overarching architectural theme or concept. All buildings must have an easily discernible principal entrance located on the primary street of the principal building or buildings. At the last Planning Commission meeting, the kind of directive was to strike this standard, suggesting it wasn't necessary. So just up from the second line from the bottom within that building design.
Mix of entrances, mix of entrances.
So, show of hands, who's comfortable striking that?
Yeah, I am,
Okay, so that's Greg, Mary, everyone. Okay.
yeah, that's okay, go ahead, strike it.
Okay, and here's where we get into the standard related to blank wall limitations. Okay, blank wall limitations are required on all sides of an OA development. No rectangular area greater than 30% of a story's facade, as measured from floor to floor, may be windowless, and no horizontal segment of a story's facade greater than 15 feet in width may be windowless, unless otherwise approved. Well, I don't know, to be honest, off the top of my
Well, we have in
head.
the past, I mean, there's.
Probably,
I mean, some-
actually, yeah, you know what? There is, it's not a lodging development, but there is a warehouse on the highway that was recently constructed that has a very long blank wall. There's one window. So and we have encouraged them to, add some dimensionality to that, and I have been told that they are going to be adding some vegetation and other design features. But yeah, that would be a very recent example of a building that went up with the warehouse, yeah. But it's also, our entrance corridor from the south, and sets the stage for the appearance of our community as you're driving into it.
One thing to note is originally this discussion was on the just front-facing side of the building, but since we made the recommendation to extend that to all sides, since especially in the rural parts of the county, any development would be seen from multiple directions, possibly residential zones, that now if you think about some of the even hotel development, you might have one wall that is blank
On the
across the front. It
backside
just
or
might not be
something.
the front wall.
Yeah.
So thinking about the residential impacts or the view shed impacts around all sides changes the way we were considering it.
I don't see it's an issue.
Is there other options besides windows to break up those 15 feet?
There's some that are that we haven't gotten to yet.
Yeah, they're up higher. But I think where you're getting at, which is that, even if it's not a window, could you break up the facade by adding some of these other elements? I think that we could probably integrate this standard with the one that is 2 boxes up from it. So can we just take a look at that in a few minutes? Okay. So generally speaking, and again, these aren't final, these are straw poll votes. We'll have another, chance to crack this with the Planning Commission and the County Council in the coming months. But show of hands in support of these blank wall limitations. Okay, so all in favor except for, are you opposed, Greg? Okay. Okay. Okay, so moving up the table, for uses located on the ground floor facing the primary fronting street, 60% minimum ground story transparency is required, measured floor to floor. Transparency is any glass in windows and or doors, including any mullions that is highly transparent with low reflectance. This is where we start to see a differentiation between the urbanizing and the rural district. So in the urbanizing district, the Planning Commission, and we don't have boundaries for these yet, but just kind of keep in your mind like the general notion of, a more urbanizing area versus, a rural area. So in an urbanizing area, the Planning Commission thought that for uses located on the ground floor facing the primary fronting street, this 60% minimum transparency requirement is a standard. And in the rural areas, that would not be a standard. And the idea here is that the transparency creates a sense of fluidity between the private space and the public space. It creates some dynamism between the, developed part of the community and, all of the space around it.
It also has to do with safe streets and making, if there's some activity, then that's a good thing for reducing crime.
But it also contributes to light pollution.
If the lights are facing outwards.
It's important.
It is, yeah.
80% of your
Yeah.
thing is windows. You're gonna have light coming out, no matter what you do.
It's true.
Can you think of a property here that has less than 60% on the front? I'm just trying to picture what it might compare to.
On the ground floor.
Yeah.
Well, I believe the Wyndham Wingate only has windows on the upper stories. Certainly not 60%, even if it's on the lower stories. I don't know if the Homewood Suites, as a downtown example, would meet the 60% requirement or not.
No, I've
Um,
never.
And
Seems like they have, I mean, their windows are kind of back behind that little mini
Right.
thing, but
This is pretty standard language. I've worked in a couple other places that use this. Salt Lake City does for all their stuff downtown. But,
Yeah, but Salt Lake City's not a dark sky town.
no, but they're working on it. But Park City uses this language. So does, it'd be interesting.
I mean, my personal feeling is that this standard is more critical within city limits than it is in the county at all. We had discussed at the Planning Commission just striking it all together, but then there was some discussion that, in an urbanizing node, that we would want to try to create some continuity of the downtown streetscape.
Yeah, I think, I'm picturing some of the things on kind of the north end of downtown here, where the front of the building doesn't actually front the highway.
Right.
And then you've kind of got like the butt of the building.
Yeah, what is that, the Adventure Inn? That's probably an example of that, where the side of that building that's facing the street.
I was even thinking further north.
You were thinking further north?
Longer, like the Comfort Inn or Days Inn. And there's a newer one that I think was in one of your slides.
Oh, yes,
That's-
the Hampton Inn. That's a perfect example.
So I wonder, when I think about this standard, and given that we don't know exactly where the urbanizing district is going to be drawn, I think it makes a lot of sense in downtown Moab, and it makes less sense for these hotels that have like a big parking lot between them and the street. And so, perhaps one idea would be to rewrite it and just say for buildings that are within a certain distance of the main street, they have to do this standard, and if they're set back, they don't.
In the urbanizing district
in the
only.
urbanizing areas.
Okay, I think that's a reasonable modification.
So, for me, this is tied to the use on the ground floor, and it seems, my recollection of reading through the items above this particular point was that there's some discussion on whether or not to, make part of the ground floor public use. And so if this is strictly lodging, we're not going to require different public benefit uses on the ground floor. I myself, if I'm a lodger, I don't want 60% to be a window. So
True too.
I think it's really tied to that for me.
True too. And this, for today, we can also just say, this is one that we're not going to have consensus on, and the Planning Commission, works on it a little bit more. I think that might be the best way to keep us going, because there are other items on the agenda. So, I guess show of hands that kick this one back to the Planning Commission.
Kick it back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
One way to look at it might be that retail versus, room or residential kind of space in the building.
Can we revisit this after we revisit the mixed-use
Sure.
rows? 'Cause
Yeah,
I think that
and we
this
can
is
either
very
do that
tied to
today or with the Planning Commission.
Because it would help
if we have
with
time.
direction based off of that.
Sure. Okay, so this is more, the next box up is building design shall vary between vertical facade divisions and from adjacent buildings by the type of dominant material or color, scale, or orientation of that material, and at least two of the following: the proportion of recesses and projections, the location of the entrance and window placement unless storefronts are utilized, roof type, plane, or material unless otherwise stated in the building type requirements. Yeah, I think we could probably rewrite that in a much simpler manner. That's hard for me to even understand, to be honest.
I don't want a bunch of Soviet block type apartments.
Correct. That's exactly what we're going for there.
We have a different way to say that.
I think
Soviet buildings
style
prohibited.
architecture.
that's supplemental definition. Of what we need to say about
could visualize it. We all know her.
Okay, so show of hands for keeping the standard that requires, variation in vertical and horizontal facades. And we'll have to work on the language because I don't like what's in there. Okay. Okay, so going up, this might actually get at it, now that I'm looking at it. The next two standards say more than 5 feet shift in vertical and horizontal facade for each 30 linear feet is required, and then no facade shall exceed 60 feet in length. I mean, what do you think, Nora? Could we just go with the 5 foot shift and drop the one above it?
If you wish, yeah.
I mean, it almost seems like the one above it is redundant in some ways, but maybe I'm just not thinking through all the possibilities.
Well, I think the one above it is saying that, the facade can't exceed 50 feet in length, which means the wall, I think, is how it was intended. This came from Mark Lassick at Landmark.
Gotcha. Okay.
And that has to do, it's also related to the scale of the buildings that we've been talking about a
Right.
little bit.
Okay. So all in favor of those two standards, which add additional specificity to the requirement that you have to break up the vertical and horizontal facades.
I think it's less critical when you have a motel that's 104 feet back from the road. You have a big parking lot between the road and the actual building. I'm trying to picture in my mind what we're talking about here.
It's still that same Soviet era block building. It's just a way to avoid that.
I have it on my phone.
Or Whittier, Alaska.
The Hyatt up there is really different all the way down.
Yeah.
But the one just to the north of it is just.
Yeah.
It's like a Soviet one.
Yeah, I think that's the example if I'm thinking of the same hotels, there's a hotel that changes its name every year. At one time it was River Canyon Lodge. Yeah, River Canyon. And then there's the newish one at the base of, below the restaurant where the tram is. And, there's a world of difference between those two buildings. And I think, one of them's broken up, and I think it's a lot better visually.
Yeah, it looks nice.
Okay, so show of hands in favor?
Yeah.
That looks like all. Okay,
Yeah, I just needed an example.
that's great. Okay, we're done with building design.
Wow.
The other thing that we plan to do is put in diagrams, little box diagrams about breaking up mass and stuff like that as well.
Yeah, we still have a lot to get through. Okay, site configuration is what we're talking about now, okay? All development must fit the property, no mass grading or grading of a flat building envelope. The building must step with the terrain. So that would be like prohibiting somebody just cutting off the side of a mountain to get a flat building pad. We have this in our code already, so this is just further specification of what we already have. I think we can just go straight to all in favor.
Yes, if it's already.
Okay.
Yeah.
The next one above that says primary uses must face the fronting roadway. And this is where we see some differentiation between the urbanizing district and the rural district, where in the urbanizing that requirement stands, and in the rural district it wouldn't be applied. And I think our logic here was that, the farther you get from, downtown Moab or, a really, urbanizing node, then the less important this standard is.
Most of what's being built now that I see coming into the north is well back on the road. It's faced different directions. Some of them are facing north, some of them are facing south, some of them are facing the road.
Zachariah, what is your concept again of the differentiation geographically between urbanizing and rural? Is Cisco and Thompson?
I would call those rural. I mean, this is a topic of conversation that we need to get to if the county is going to go with this concept. But I mean, I would say just right off the top of my head, I would say, from south to north, the node around the intersection of Spanish Trail Road and Highway 191, the intersection of Mill Creek Drive and US 191, right where the USU campus is going to go. Everything north from there along the highway until you hit city limits. That would be everything south of Moab city limits, in my opinion, that would count as urbanizing. And then north of the city of Moab, maybe around the Colorado River, right, where the Canyons by Night node is. And then I think there's some debate as to whether the intersection of Highway 191 and State Route 313 would count as well. But that would be one I think that could engender some conversation.
I'll hold my comment until we get to that discussion as to the boundaries of these various zones.
Right, and it doesn't mean that like all of Grand County, other than the urbanizing areas, needs to be covered by the rural district. There can still be small polygons for these rural districts as well. It doesn't. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just thinking.
It's not like it's conceptualized that everything else is left open to
we may be giving Thompson Springs a kind of short shrift here if we are saying anything goes out there. We don't really care about the aesthetics and the usability of that space because eventually it is going to grow.
That's true. Yeah, so Thompson could be an urbanizing node.
So I might need to wrestle with this one a little bit more because there's a lot of properties in our commercial district that are deeper than they are wide. And so I think that's why we've seen a lot of these hotels kind of getting built where the primary use is facing kind of sideways and not the fronting road. And like, as a guest, like I would imagine there's not going to be a bunch of parking on the short side. So like if you had to, park a quarter mile from the front of the building and carry your bags in to like check in. So I see what we're going for here to avoid those like butt ends of the building facing the frontage road, but I don't know
how critical it is.
Yeah, I don't know how a way that we can capture like keep some curb appeal.
Depends on the property.
Right.
Exactly.
I think most of those properties are within the city limits.
True. Yeah.
So what if we, and this is when I think that I could say, straw poll vote for the way it's laid out now, and then work on perhaps an exception when the parcel lends itself to just to an alternative layout, but maintaining this notion that there's, some kind of primary usage element that does face the front, or like some curb appeal. Yeah, let's just leave it as curb appeal for now. Like, I think I get what you're saying.
And that idea of interacting that we've brought up in these meetings before, where it's not just like walling off the community from properties.
Okay, so let's just say then work on that.
Yeah.
All in favor of that approach. And I don't know when Mary left. Does anybody know when Mary left? Just now? Okay.
I think she just.
Okay, so work on unique lot. Okay, so let's go up to density and scale now. I'm going to skip over this redevelopment one for now, because I think it only makes sense in the context of the stuff that's above it. So for this box, or these categories of development standards, density and scale, let's go from top to bottom. So the Planning Commission has talked a lot about, at the last meeting talked a lot about what would be appropriate in terms of limiting the scale and density of new overnight accommodations developments. I think generally speaking here, the goal is to just avoid big box, big gigantic lodging developments. I don't need to name any. I think all of you probably have in your own mind some that stand out as being exceptionally large and too large for this community. I think some of the design standards that we're working on will help with that, but nevertheless, sometimes just a huge building is a huge building, no matter how many architectural features you add to it. So the standards here suggest that everywhere, both conceptualized districts, no one building would be larger than 15,000 square feet or 35 bedrooms or RV spaces. And that the total project square footage would not exceed some level. The Planning Commission couldn't reach consensus as to a total maximum project size at their last meeting. But the idea here is to have a maximum building size and then a maximum project size, so you could potentially get multiple buildings, smaller buildings, to reach your maximum project size. So while you talk, Garish, I'm going to bring up the table that is in the packet that has the square footages of some existing hotels that we used as references.
That'd be great.
So
what I had in mind was if new overnight accommodation hotel motels are going to be allowed, small boutique type hotels would be more appropriate. The way this standard is currently written, it would be, what is the big one that's going up out there with the many buildings?
Worldmark.
Yeah.
The Wyndham Worldmark.
So picture in your mind, is that where we want to go? You can meet the standard by having 15,000 square feet per building, but you could have an infinite number of buildings that you could squeeze onto the lot. Or would you rather limit the total size of the development with a smaller overall development? And so when you look at this table, I was thinking, in my mind, if we were looking at kind of small boutique motels and hotels, the Apache and the Bowen kind of fit into what I thought would be more appropriate for Grand County to move towards. But the way the standard's written, you could have, potentially 5 Apaches or 5 Bowen motels if the lot was big enough to accommodate it all.
Well, I disagree with that because we didn't set a maximum project size. So if you were to say maximum building size is 15,000 square feet, maximum project size is 60,000 square feet, you couldn't have 5 of those. You could only have 4 of those buildings. Right, and I'm not saying that it has to be 60,000, but they do work in concert with each other. They're not mutually exclusive, and we should be thinking about them together.
So that's the crux, is do you think 60 or 100,000 square foot project sizes are appropriate, or do you think we should try to limit the size of the project?
And I would say, Nora and I have talked about this a few times. I think I'm just going to come out and say it. I think that reasonable numbers would be maximum building size is 20 or 25,000 square feet, and maximum project size would be 50,000 square feet. That's if you look at some of the hotels that are on there, I would say Sage Creek would probably fall into this category as well, because they've got a lot of really big buildings. That's the condo development going in south of town. So it's not just hotels that this would apply to. The Red Cliffs condos on the highway on the opposite side of the road might have been subject to this or limited by this. But basically, my feeling is like there are two goals. One is to, and these aren't my goals. These are the goals that I think are germane to this conversation. One goal is, there's concern about just allowing too much growth in the lodging sector. Another is having, projects, regardless of the number of buildings, that are too large and impactful on the surrounding areas. And then third, I think, is that there's the visual impact concern. And I think that with some of the other standards and with the maximum building size, just by virtue of breaking up a project, even if it's a large project, into a number of buildings, you create light and space and air and dimensionality to a project, and it eliminates some of my concerns about the larger project size. So, maybe that gives you a little bit of additional context or helpfulness in thinking about this, but I think these two standards are really, really important.
One thing that comes to mind that has not been addressed at a planning commission meeting is that this is making the assumption that the entire project is specific to lodging and doesn't account for potential employee housing, that we might be willing to accept a size increase at an exchange rate of employee housing. And I think, Colin coming in front of the planning commission and talking about his plan is a perfect example of that. And is that something that the council would consider? And should we be considering that in our conversations?
Yeah, so this could also just be restricted to the lodging components of the development.
Yeah, when I was first looking at this, I was also thinking about the possibility of like a convention center or something like that, where it was, there could be a central kind of meeting space or other use with then smaller, like, you see it a lot in resorts where it's like Snowbird will host an event and there's conference rooms and breakouts, but not everybody's staying in one hotel. It's kind of like around.
So thinking back to when we did the scoping starting 9 months ago, this idea of limiting the size came up a lot at that time. But my recollection of that discussion is it wasn't mainly about just visual impacts. It was also just about the economics. And I think a point I first heard made by Curtis Wells, I think, was that smaller hotels are sort of more accessible to local entrepreneurs. And so local business people are more like, instead of like a big corporation building a giant hotel, we could have, sort of a local person build a smaller boutique hotel. And, just the idea being that for future, we've already got a lot of big hotels, but for future development, maybe we should weight the scales in favor of smaller, more local things. So that's a reason for limiting size. It has nothing to do with appearance or any of these things. And I actually find that kind of a persuasive reason. I think if all we care about is appearance, then some of the other standards we've done are adequate. And, maybe, this doesn't, it helps, it supplements those, but it's not a big deal. But I think it would make a very big impact just in terms of the types of businesses and developments that come to our community.
Yeah, another kind of thing for me is like the chicken or the egg, or like putting the cart before the horse, or whatever other kind of saying. But like, because we don't have clear standards of when projects would be approved yet, this is kind of like, what are we looking at? Because for me, if we could get like one nice development and check our quota off and say, okay, great, we'll have this one sweet spot, but then be done, then it's for me, it might be a little easier to swallow than like, okay, we're going to do a bunch of little tiny ones before we meet our quota or whatever our limiting factor would be if we adopt one.
I was thinking that instead of having a quota like in the high-density housing overlay where you set 300 as the, at least temporarily as the limit, you'd be looking at some criteria where the council would welcome additional projects to be proposed, which is in line with the majority of the opinions that were expressed during that period 9 months ago when people said we've got more than we need already, we don't need more, we don't need to add to it. So I don't know how you're going to deal with that, Evan, but it seemed to me like what the majority of the public asked for was stop it, and then when there is a definite need, a public need for additional overnight accommodations, you would work on establishing the criteria where you'd be starting to accept them.
I guess I also like the boutique idea. I like, and I think it might be important to kind of limit it to the lodging size of the project, whether that's, they're going to have multiple use for guide services on the ground floor or a convention center or something like that, that not necessarily go towards their total space thing. But then I think we also get into like what is a boutique? I think our idea of what a boutique hotel would be different than like Vegas's idea of what a boutique hotel is. And so I don't really know if today I'm ready to like call out numbers and square footage and number of bedrooms, but
Okay, well, I think that these two are perhaps the most critical of all of the standards that we're talking about in terms of the types of overnight accommodations developments that we're going to get in this community. Because this dictates the economics of a development probably, certainly as much as anything else and probably more.
Yeah, and we just had a joint planning commission city council meeting at the city, and they were all over our council's all over the place on this one. So, but what I don't want to have happen is for us to allow bigger projects than you guys allow, because that's sort of backwards a little bit. I mean, we don't want to encourage necessarily these big, large projects to only be within the city limits, if we allow them at all. But I think we need to look to consistency.
So did this 35 bedroom, did this come from the planning commission? Is that?
Yeah.
Or was this just
That was the planning commission.
And that's based on Zachariah had the list of various hotels, and what I had in mind, maybe boutique is the wrong descriptor, but
Smaller scale.
what I had in mind was smaller seems to fit better the public sentiment than larger.
Yeah.
So,
I
and there's some
think that's fair.
successful hotels that are smaller, with 30, 35 rooms. So that's why.
Granted that most of those were built a long time ago and have been redeveloped a few times, and so the land economics is very different for them, but that's okay. I mean,
That's okay.
Part of what's going on right now is that we have allowed, our zoning rules set the rules of the market, so like, that's part of what has been going on there.
So I can see the smaller boutique kinds of hotels more in the populated urban areas of like the city. And I think that if you try and plunk down little hotels here, there, and wherever they can be allowed, you're also passing up the opportunity to create an environment that has more vibrancy than perhaps, like for example, if you take the Apache and quite frankly, that's an isolated piece of property. And there really isn't anything going on around it except maybe the barber shop across the street, you know, or whatever. Well, Mills is down the block, you know, so.
It's a non-conforming use right now.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that in my opinion, you know, those smaller boutique hotels are very appropriate, but in a more populated area. And I think that it doesn't hurt to look at a more complete kind of development with maybe smaller buildings, but more uses. You know, if this whole concept of you know, nodal development develops, you know, moving down 191, you know, around the Shell station or whatever, wherever, so that you get more of a vibrancy out of it than you may otherwise.
Terry, just to clarify, are you suggesting, as a straw man, that larger developments would make sense in the rural areas to incentivize development and smaller boutique in urban or urbanizing areas? Did I hear you correctly?
What I'm saying, I guess, is, I mean, you could construe it that way, and it probably would work that way if there was enough multi-use activity in the area where that hotel was being built. In other words, you know, if you take the Shell station area as an example, if you put up a 25-room motel there and a Shell station, and that's the end of it, you know, then that doesn't seem like a very good commercial node to me. Whereas if you put up you know, a development that has some retail, you know, maybe a restaurant or 2 restaurants or whatever, and then smaller, you know, buildings or whatever in the development that can be utilized for housing, either, you know, employee housing for the hotel itself or different buildings in the hotel, then you have a much more vibrant sort of mini community there that seems to me to be more palatable than and that way, you know, you limit the infringement on the residential areas in the rural part of the county because you're concentrating that type of development more in one area. So that's just my take.
So I'm getting a little nervous about time. We've got a few more things to go through, and there are other items on the agenda, and there's another meeting in here at 12:30. So I feel a little bad that I didn't get to this one first, and some of the next ones that we're going to go through. So that is unfortunate, but I think that we're going to have to revisit this one. Given the criticality of the decisions, I think that we're going to have to spend some focused time on it, and I think that staff will probably send a memo outlining, I think, what we've heard and the various issues, and we're going to need you to do some thinking on this, because the next time we visit it, we're going to need to make some decisions, and they're going to need to be some, I think, you know, well-reasoned decisions.
Nora mentioned at the joint meeting of the city that there was some ranges thrown out. Would the council members be comfortable just ballparking their ranges of comfort or discomfort at this point, just so we can get a sense of where they're at?
I think that's a reasonable.
That would be helpful.
Yes, I'm not going to ask for a straw poll, but if we can just get some ranges.
You know, with Terry's idea of like that we're discussing outside downtown, the idea that there could be like a resort almost, that where there would be enough rooms to support a restaurant and things like that. You know, I could see something like the Hoodoo being self-contained outside of downtown. You know, where people aren't driving back and forth for dinner and activities and things. Whereas, you know, I would see that people, if there was something the size of the Apache that doesn't have a pool or whatever, that I guess they do have a pool, that people would be kind of traveling back and forth more. And so, know that's a pretty vague answer for range, but I could wrap my mind around something that was larger than 35 units in another area.
Okay. Any other thought? I mean, it's fine if you don't have any at this point. I think, for me, it sounds like we just still have a lot of work to do on this. Okay, let's move on.
You can always start restrictive and then see how things go and loosen things up. It would be a lot harder to allow big and then go smaller.
That's true, too.
I would,
Put that in the notes.
yeah, I like that thought a lot, and I would favor the 35 or less boutique, even outside of the city area. I mean, one reason is to get a product. First of all, when we started this process, for me, it was start restrictive, and then if we need to loosen up, go ahead. Two reasons for that. We have a lot of visitors that we can't take care of that come here right now, so getting a handle on that first. But the other thing for me is, in addition to liking the product that we end up with, we don't want big box hotels or big, huge things. The other thing is there aren't enough workers to staff what we have. And so if we're going to allow way bigger establishments than the 35, it's just going to keep exacerbating the problem.
Okay, so let's move on, and I'm going to just say, let's try to wrap this up, our portion of the joint, or the county council meeting at,
It must be different.
Can we do it in 10 minutes?
let's say 11:50.
Okay.
That work?
Yep.
Okay, so height. Well, let me actually just ask the group then. Basically, the two remaining standards that I think are of greatest importance today in terms of conversation between the Planning Commission and the County Council are there's what we have left is height, mixed use elements, and some, I think, what I would consider like minor updates to the transportation component. I think that the mixed use element is probably of greater import to the council, but I don't want to make that decision for you.
It seems the grayest area.
Okay, so let's go to that. Okay.
We're going where again?
We're going to go up to mixed use.
Okay, that's
Okay, so there's a lot of text in the table here, and basically we've done a lot of internal discussion. We've had a lot of internal discussion about mixed-use requirements. We've spent a fair amount of time talking with Nora. We've talked with a handful of developers and economic consultants. And as much as I think that we have a desire to get better balance in our community between lodging developments and other commercial uses, I'm not sure that we're going to have a lot of success legislating that with really strict like percentages or square footage requirements. Historically, local governments have done a pretty poor job of mandating mixed-use development in a way that's successful. It's not that there are zero success stories, but there are many, many, many more unsuccessful efforts to mandate mixed-use development. So the other thing is that, a hotel developer wants to be a hotel developer, a campground developer wants to be a campground developer. They don't want to be restaurateurs, they don't want to be daycare providers, they don't want to be office space lease, landlords. I think that many of the other changes that we've made, in particular pulling out lodging uses as a principal use from our zone district and or from our use table, and then, putting them into these overlays, like, we've already changed the market dynamics quite a bit to allow for these other commercial developments to have a chance at coming online and flourishing. And I think that there's just some element of reality that, with some of the changes that we've made, if some of these other uses don't become economically viable, then we may not be able to just legislate them, and we're going to have to get them in a different way, either through, public resources or, stronger incentives and that sort of thing.
Has there been any discussion, or, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
So I would just say that, our kind of general recommendation right now is to maybe eliminate the mixed-use requirement altogether, which I know sounds kind of surprising, given that it has been a central theme of our conversations for the last 9 months. But if you do have a mixed-use requirement, I would strongly advocate for just allowing a developer to figure out what will work for their development. Whether it's civic space, open space, a restaurant, retail space, whatever. Let them figure it out. Or, add some flexibility into the standard that it could change over time, what the non-lodging use would be. But I guess, after a lot of thought over the last few months, I am kind of the opinion personally that it's going to be challenging for us to specify exactly what we want and make sure and ensure that it's successful.
A thing that kind of changed my thinking a little bit too is thinking of existing small businesses that are retail and restaurant. And if you have strict requirements for mixed use coming in hotel or, lodging businesses, you're essentially, so if they put a hotel in their lodging business, that hotel is being subsidized by the fact that you can rent out rooms. It's essentially like being like, the restaurant is being propped up by the hotel use in a way that existing restaurant in town doesn't have that resource. And so the existing small businesses, small restaurants, small retail that are operating without that, potential hotel money or being able to draw on those resources are going to be at something of a disadvantage. And so I think considering that in the context of mixed use, it kind of shifted my thinking a little bit.
I think that's all very true. However, that being said, somehow you still have to provide the opportunity for those other uses to exist.
Right.
And it's if you look countrywide, approximately 65% of all retail businesses go bankrupt within the first 3 years because people don't know how to be in retail and restaurant. So, I think that allowing, if in fact mixed use were required, I think it's almost paramount that you allow the developer to, to choose what the space would be used for. But I guess my concern with the whole subject of mixed use is having the hotel itself preempt the space for other things to happen in that small community that the hotel is creating around it. Certainly when you have a big building, it has an impact on properties around it. And if there isn't any, it's not viable to have anything other than a hotel or residential, then where are the services? Then everybody's in their car traveling to where the services are. I guess my whole argument about mixed use is trying to provide the opportunity to have other uses that will allow people to stay out of their automobiles.
Right.
And get around a little bit on foot.
Terry, I would like to tag on that just briefly. One of the concepts that we've been working on is that a detriment to economic diversity in Grand County has been the price of land. And as long as the market is determining what the highest and best use is, because hotels or campgrounds or other overnight accommodations is the highest and best use, those small retailers and other business owners are never going to be able to compete in the real estate market.
That's true.
Yeah, I get,
Yeah.
therefore, where are you going to create the space to make that happen? And if you make it happen within, within a hotel in some way, you're still going to have some problems, perhaps, unless the hotel ownership has a skin in the game, because the rentals, the rental costs of that property for an outsider probably will end up being strongly, if not prohibitive, close to it.
So I wanted to echo something that Zachariah said, which is I think we actually have already sort of on the books a very good tool for promoting mixed use, which is the eligibility zone district boundaries. And I think if we keep those district boundaries small, similar to like option 4 in the landmark plan, then there's going to be a lot of land where overnight accommodations is not an option, and so people will develop other things, and we get mixed uses that way. I think that's the sort of, drawing those boundaries, I think is, we're not talking about it today, but it's probably the most important decision we'll make. And I kind of agree with Zachariah that it's, you're kind of opening up a can of worms and trying to regulate mixed use, and we can accomplish a very similar goal much more cleanly just by saying that, here's a bunch of commercial land that's not available to overnight accommodations, and that's where we'll get our mixture. So
I would add to that we do have some work in terms of adding more commercial uses back into our commercial zones than are currently allowed. So for instance, like, it might make you all, raise an eyebrow, but the county at some point eliminated retail from its highway commercial zone. Pretty strange, right? Except that the logic was push all of the sales tax to the city of Moab, keep your downtown core strong. They don't have a property tax. I mean, it's more complex than that, but I think, from what I understand, that was a strong line of reasoning about prohibiting retail in the highway commercial zone. It was also to facilitate some kind of larger, manufacturing and industrial processes, but nevertheless, like, we have to get some of these uses that we want to see back into the use table, now that, they won't necessarily have to be competing with lodging.
I think this is tied to two important things that extend beyond this conversation. First is the planning for areas like that node where Mill Creek hits 191, where the university will be. Do we hope that to be a walkable, commercialized zone to keep some of that traffic from going into downtown or not? Or do we expect that to happen? If so, we should be incentivizing the type of standards that will help to produce that sort of, or allow us at least to curate that sort of growth. And that affects the other standards in this table, such as walkability and so on. And then there is this issue of creating those liminal spaces between lodging development, tourism type development, and the community. And I think when we talk mixed use, we often go to restaurants and retail space, but there is, natural resource set-asides, like, again, Colin brought to the land grant, saying, I'm willing to put this in a land grant. This,
Conservation easement.
Yes, conservation easement. There's venue space, there's conference rooms, there's other sort of public domain benefits that don't have to be restaurants. And I think by giving the developer the opportunity to define that, it puts the onus on them to say, this is why this development benefits the community and not just me, while not restricting. So I think that there's a case to be made for it actually starts the community without creating.
Lodging units on top of it. That is still entirely possible within the code. It just means that the county would not be mandating that if somebody wanted to do the 3 lodging units or 5 lodging units or 10 lodging units, they'd have to also do the restaurant. So it's just one way and not the other. But
Except that they're not building those currently, you know. I don't know. I don't know if we talked a little bit about a payment in lieu of, you know, as well. And I keep going back to that you mentioned long ago when the comments were coming in, and how a high school student mentioned that when these developments are occurring, it's taking land out of the public domain. So there's fewer places for the public to go. And then I keep thinking of the Archway Inn, which allows the public to use that open space. And it's just I feel good about that hotel being there because of that, you know. It's a very open, inviting kind of space. And I think too about, well, okay, if we want to encourage some other types of development, then in the back of my mind, it's like, well, we want to make it, maybe this isn't the right way to say it, but make it more, provide more limitations to the development of overnight accommodations, and that could be one of them. Like, okay, if you want to build this, then you need to contribute money to our coffers to build public space, or you need to provide it. I don't know. That's my 2 cents.
so closing thoughts, we've got just a couple of minutes.
If we were to completely remove the mixed-use requirements, I would be interested in seeing some sort of incentive where it was like either they got more rooms if they incorporated mixed use, or a payment in lieu of, where they could contribute to other community projects and get some kind of perks out of it.
Okay.
But I definitely respect the idea that there's not a great track record of local governments regulating this mixed use.
I'm hesitant about mandating that we come up with some kind of mixed use thing. I think that's problematic. I don't see it real.
If we're wrapping it up, there are 2 other, I don't think we have time to talk about it, but there are 2 other aspects of building height that some feedback to the planning commission would be good. One is, do we limit building height to the current heights within the base zone district, or do we even want to restrict that further? And the second is, we've identified a need to try to protect the view sheds. And those are the directions that you'd like us to go? Say, a building that could be taller if it has less impact of the view shed, say from Main Street or Highway 191. If it's closer to the highway, it has to be shorter. And do you think the height restrictions on the base zone district are adequate as they are, or should we look at even limiting that height, which is now 35 feet?
I like the view shed.
Yes.
View shed method.
Yeah, I mean, the building height at 35 feet is a reality already.
Well, this is what we're talking about in the future. We could restrict it.
Yeah, I think in reality, well, it just depends on how long it develops 20 or 30 years from now. But the next thing that's going to happen is the pressure's going to be put on for additional stories. I mean, after the land's gone, people are going to go up, and it's just going to happen.
Or go somewhere else.
Yeah, well, going somewhere else may or may not be an option, depending on what the financial reward is for going up.
I think the closer you are to land that's elevated, the less critical it is on height.
Well, I mean,
I think we're going to have to come back to
Yes,
this.
come back,
The
yeah,
council's
because-
got to move on.
It doesn't sound like there's a big push to go less than the current underlying layer, but we can visit it again in the future with some additional considerations.
I mean, I'm not gonna say that we have a straw poll or anything on it. I'm just gonna say let's revisit it, and
so that's it for our discussion item?
I think at this point,
Great.
we've run out of time.
We have a couple time-sensitive things. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming today and all your hard work leading into this. Appreciate what you're doing, and please know that your advice is much appreciated and taken to heart for sure.
Thank you.
We'll continue to push things back to you. Value your take on it.
Thanks.
Next up is action items. Action item B is approving a proposed letter to the BLM regarding e-bike policy on non-motorized trails. We have a letter drafted here. Zachariah, you want to walk us through this?
Sure, I have so a few months ago, the Secretary of the Interior distributed a secretarial order instructing all of the DOI land management agencies to work on rules that would accommodate e-bikes where other bicycles are allowed. They gave the agencies the first 14 days to come up with those rules, then extended it to 30. A few months after that, we have not heard anything from the local BLM field office. And then last week, there was an information bulletin that was released by the federal BLM office that didn't say actually a whole lot of new information, but it did specify that field offices could maintain their restrictions or on designated non-motorized trails if there were adequate justifications for them, and would need to send a letter to the state BLM office. In general, all of these announcements and information bulletins and secretarial orders have created a lot of confusion in the public about whether or not e-bikes are allowed, where they're allowed, who's in control, who gets to, do the law enforcement on it. And so, I think first and foremost, we, have a responsibility to communicate to the BLM that we need to clarify all of this, because the longer we go in this period of confusion, the harder it becomes for Grand County, which has, funded, planned, designed, constructed, and maintained, all of the non-motorized trail infrastructure in this community to have a voice in what should actually happen going forward. The letter kind of grew out of this milieu as far as I'm concerned. And, I worked with Trail Mix board members, various stakeholder groups in the non-motorized trails community. I've spoken with officials at the BLM. They've seen this draft letter. They've provided comments on it. The red line changes that are on the letter in front of you right now reflect the feedback that I received, which was quite positive and appreciative that we have taken this step. And there were some minor recommendations to further expand on the grant components that are referenced in the letter. So in addition to trying to clear this up, I think that the point of this letter was to clarify Grand County's position on the matter of e-bikes. And based on my conversations with our Active Transportation and Trails Division, which is in my department, Trail Mix, which is the non-motorized advisory body to the county council, and frankly the BLM, there are several justifications in the letter for Grand County, or what I would suggest Grand County's position should be, and many others, is that e-bikes, remain prohibited on designated non-motorized single track and that we encourage the BLM Moen Field Office to also maintain that position.
Question. When I read through this, understand that one of the things that I did not see in this paper to begin with was what is the current interaction between e-bikes and regular bikes now?
So I think that's a good question. I think it's important to highlight that this, the thing that came out, it's not, the e-bikes are not limited to pedal assists, which are much more similar to traditional mountain bikes. And it basically would allow a more powerful electronic bike onto the non-motorized trails. So a bike that you wouldn't even have to pedal, that would actually have a throttle, and it would basically be an electric motorcycle. So it's basically anything that's not gas-powered and balanced on two wheels would be allowed on our non-motorized trails. And so the conflict comes that they travel at different paces, and so a traditional mountain bike might travel faster downhill, and then you come to an uphill, and then the guy with the motor passes you, and then you come to the next downhill, and then you're catching up to the motor, and it's a lot of
But that's going to be the case with regular bikes anyway, because you got some guys that are going to be stronger than others. And
it's not as the electronic bikes
It's
with
not
a throttle.
dangerous, that's
It's,
for sure.
yeah.
So I think some of the other key components are that, first, there's a lot of, there are a lot of miles of designated routes where e-bikes are allowed on dirt. Secondly, all of the funding that went to planning, designing, constructing, building, and maintaining these designated non-motorized routes was earmarked for designated non-motorized routes. The thousands of hours of volunteer time, probably over $100,000 at this point in private donations. They have all been earmarked for, and the people giving that time and money believe that they have been earmarked for non-motorized travel. Every trail that has been built since the RMP has gone through an environmental assessment, environmental review process, where e-bikes were not contemplated within the usage that would occur on those trails. The trails were designed and constructed to accommodate non-motorized travel, not motorized travel. So there's we don't have adequate understanding at this point of the varying levels of impacts from e-bikes. But I think the well-founded assumption is that because of their power and speed, they create trail impacts and trail damage that exceeds that of a regular pedal bike.
do we know?
Yeah.
Well,
Yes,
we
we do.
know that to a certain extent, but we also don't have enough information to say definitively that they are, an acceptable use of the non-motorized trail. And so I think that, it's very clear that, from my position, that should the BLM want to change its policy on e-bike use on designated single-track, non-motorized mountain bike trails, before they do that, they should be responsible for conducting a new EA that contemplates the e-bike use, in addition to the uses that were contemplated in the original EA. And then lastly, I would say enforcement is going to be a critical challenge for the BLM. We have one law enforcement officer for all of Grand County, and as e-bikes evolve, they are going to become less and less distinguishable from pedal bikes. And like these narrow classifications of a class 1 versus a class 2 versus a class 3 e-bike are going to be impossible for an untrained eye or somebody that's looking from 2 miles away in a remote area to determine whether somebody's actually, staying within the rules that the BLM suggests.
Is there a difference between pedal assist e-bikes and just an electronic motorcycle?
Yes.
That's that class 1,
That's-
class
those
2.
are the classifications. So, and then lastly, I would say, we're probably not far from a point in time where e-bikes and e-motorcycles just morph into one thing. You get something that's like right in the middle that is, much more akin to a motorcycle than a bicycle is now. Nowadays, a pedal assist e-mountain bike is, just a little bit of it's an enhancement on a pedal mountain bike, but, the more and more it moves towards an e-motorcycle, the more and more challenging it's going to be with respect to impact mitigation.
If you go back and you look at the evolution of motorcycles, they started with bicycles, regular bicycles. Somebody figured out how to put a motor on it, and they maintained the look of a bicycle for a long time. In fact, I remember people having a bicycle, they had a little gasoline motor that attached above the back wheel. It had a little wheel thrown on that one, so that they would fire it up when they go along, and they would get an assist from gasoline motor. But it's on a bicycle frame. So
The problem is, that I see, is that the trails themselves specifically are not designed to handle the kinds of speeds that people will use the e-bikes at, either going uphill or downhill, so several things happen. One is people get hurt. The second thing is that they do tear up the trails because people are going off trail a lot if they can't control their speed on corners and in rocky areas that they shouldn't be going that fast, and so on and so forth. And
well, that's going to be your case no matter what.
not necessarily. People that are riding mountain bikes on a single track are much more circumspect of the trail conditions, I think, and it's much easier when you have an electronic assist not to not to gauge the speed and all the rest of it as much. Admittedly, e-bikes are here to stay, but I think that you really, and it's a really good thing. E-bikes are a good thing for people like me who are getting older, but quite frankly, I don't think they belong on designated, trails that are made specifically for mountain bikes.
And I will say that my position on this matter has evolved. I think a few years ago was much more open to trying to find a place and a happy medium for e-mountain bikes. Since then, though, first off, the industry has changed significantly. The mountain bike industry continues to push e-mountain bikes more and more, so their use is expanding. They are moving more to this gray area between e-bikes and e-mountain bikes. The confusion in the public about where they're allowed, how they're allowed, which classifications are allowed is creating, huge problems. And we just don't have enough information to say that, they do belong on non-motorized trails. And I think until we have that information, we should try to be much more conservative with the amount of money and time and resources we have already put into our world-class, trail infrastructure, not to mention the liabilities associated with all of the money we have spent for designated non-motorized routes, that if we were to open up, what kind of financial liabilities would be placed on the county.
What's the timeline with, we were asked for this letter, or it was kind of suggested it would be useful to them to receive something from us? Or
They encouraged us to send it as soon as possible.
as soon as possible?
I'd like to weigh in, share on the
I would
legal
like,
issues.
I've had my hand up a long time.
So-
I know, I've discovered that you can't be polite. You have to say, hey,
Okay.
She rides one.
I need to disclose that. I think that's important, that I disclose that I am an owner of an e-bike, and I love it, and it's changed my life in a very positive way.
And yours is designed for urban use?
That being said, I totally support this letter, a large part because I want to respect the people who have not only have put in, their sweat, their effort to create this incredible mountain biking scene that we have in Grand County, and that if we take their advice, what they're saying, what they believe is best for the trail, we owe it to them to give them that recognition and to honor their efforts. And so, even though I love my e-bike, I think we have areas where they're not allowed to go.
It's a commuter e-bike, but yes, thank you.
Mine is not an outlaw.
Chrissy?
It would die.
Y'all touched on the legal issues, but I just want to reiterate it. The procedure followed here is not legal, so it's very similar to what we discussed in the context of the off-road vehicle situation in the parks. This is new action, and so it requires environmental study, which they haven't done. So I think it's important that we make a public statement as to that point, be consistent with what we did just recently, and it's a very important point in the study. The environmental study is a very important process for all these reasons. So the public gets to participate. And then second is that breach of contract claim, which is viable and real. I haven't dug into all the agreements, both with the BLM and with the various grant or organizations we've received grants from. There's also private donations that are involved, but I think that it's a viable issue. It's an important issue, and we owe it to various organizations and individuals to pursue a breach of contract claim if it's there, which I think it likely is. I would need to dig in more, but I think it's a very important thing to let them know it's something that we're concerned about and we are reviewing.
Chris?
So yeah, I just want to remind the council that all the easements that we have for these single-track mountain bike trails indicate that Grand County is responsible for the maintenance of those trails. And so I would say we're already in a position where we're having a hard time keeping up with the maintenance on 150 miles of single track plus all the other activities that our staff is involved with. And so I'm pretty sure I can definitively say that at the point in time when these trails were designed, they were not designed to facilitate e-bikes. I think that there's a possibility, certainly, of designing a trail for e-bikes and that type of designation, but I don't think that any of the trails that have been built and that we're discussing right now were designed with that use in mind. And so if there is an impact and it increases the maintenance demand, it's going to be on Grand County to hire new people and spend more money to get out there and fix it. And so I think you just got to keep that in mind also, that if there is an increased maintenance cost, it's going to be on us.
Yeah, because as much as we would love to see the BLM increase its law enforcement staffing and establish its own trail crew, we are right now the de facto trail crew for the BLM, and I don't see that changing, regardless of this policy.
Do we need a motion on this?
Yes,
Yeah.
So, make a motion.
please.
I'd like to move to approve the sending proposed letter to the BLM regarding the e-bike policy on non-motorized trails and motorized signs.
And is that the red line version or the version in the packet?
It's the most recent.
The red line version highlights the commitments that were made and the donations. Motion made by Terry Morse, seconded by Mary McGann. Any further discussion? Jay Lynn?
I'll disclose, I do ride the mountain bike trails, although I'm very low-key.
I find that hard to believe. That you're low-key, not that you're riding.
And I'm rapidly becoming a member of the class that might one day utilize the e-bike. However, I would never ride an e-bike on the single track trails that I've hiked. Jeez, I think people are insane to do that. But for me, I think all of these reasons are terrific and they should definitely be guess I'm not quite ready at this point to say don't allow it. What I would like to say is study all this before considering any changes to the current policy. And so last night I took the liberty of writing a statement to replace the one in here that says in consideration, it's at the bottom of the first page of this red line version, replacing that in consideration of the above sentence. I would replace it with, and I will pass these around because it's a little bit hard to concentrate and listen and read it. I would say based on our, and this was of course last night when the letter said based on our collaboration or something like that. This has been much simplified. Based on our agency's collaboration and combined experience and expertise, Grant County and Grant County Trail Mix requests the BLM Moab Field Office strongly weigh the following when considering any potential changes regarding use of e-bikes on established non-motorized trails. And I would support that. I'm not quite ready at this point in time to tell them don't, or to don't allow them.
What if it was,
Hey, Jalen, do you have an extra?
Oh, yes.
Well, I got a whole bunch here.
Sorry.
I was the one that got it.
what if we said, preserve its current policy? And
While working for, yeah,
Yeah.
and that's fine with me too, yeah.
is that a substitute motion?
But
Is
they
that,
definitely need to look at it way closer. Yes, substitute.
okay, with the edits?
So just one quick,
that-
Yeah, I'm not clear on what the change would be.
just one quick point, though, is that Trail Mix has, several of the members have reviewed the red line version. I don't know that I would necessarily, that we should, at this point, include Trail Mix in this if we haven't passed this revision indicating that Trail Mix also requests such. It's just my only point.
Oh, that's
I would just say Grand County.
The original one does say Grand County. Okay.
The way the sentence currently reads is, in consideration of the above, Grand County encourages the Moab BLM Field Office to preserve its current policy, which does not permit e-bike use on established non-motorized trails for the following reasons. So what do you want that to, did I hear what I thought I heard correctly, that you wanted to say, in consideration of the above, Grand County encourages the Moab BLM Field Office to preserve its current policy while evaluating
Yeah, that would work,
potential changes to e-bike use?
yeah. But why does it say, I mean, of course I have, this is the first I saw the revised letter, so.
Oh, that can change.
Scrambled to read through it, but in consideration of the above, I mean, I think some of the things that are listed below are certainly
Yeah.
important, so I'm not sure I would limit it.
Yeah, so do you want to use the clause that you provided as the opener, based on our agency's collaboration and combined experience and expertise, instead of in consideration of the above?
Yeah, well, mine says weigh the following, but maybe the sentence is in the wrong place. I don't know. My other question is this so urgent that we can't think about this new letter and bring it up at Tuesday's meeting? It is.
Well, it's pretty urgent. It was urgent on Friday because we had a congressional delegation coming, and the acting BLM director was here and went on an e-bike ride with our the Moab Field Office manager, and this was, a topic of discussion. I would also say it's urgent because we need to establish clarity for the public as quickly as possible, because there are reputable websites that get a lot of traffic, like Pink Bike and others, that have put out incorrect statements regarding e-bike policy. And even within the Moab BLM Field Office, there have been shifting positions, and I think that we just need to get to a point where there is one very clear position, and Grand County's voice is strong within, that conversation.
And with that in mind, and the time sensitivity, I am comfortable with the red line version as presented this morning, but recognizing your sensitivities. I'm fine with doing it as this. If it's,
What Zachariah just reread mine.
okay.
Okay, so do you want me to reread that sentence one more time?
Well, are you making a substitute motion, Jane?
Yes.
Okay. Let's get a second first before we do any more.
Okay.
Substitute motion made, which encourages,
Maybe Zachariah could read that in the substitute motion form. Based on our application.
Sure. Based on our agency's collaboration and combined experience and expertise, Grand County encourages the Moab BLM Field Office to preserve its current policy, which does not permit e-bike use on established motorized trails, or preserve its current policy while evaluating potential changes to e-bike policy or e-bike use on established non-motorized trails. Was that clear enough?
does that imply like going through the actual process, which they skipped this time? Does that, Chrissy, does that, yeah, sorry.
While following a formal process?
Yeah,
I like it, yeah.
yeah, formal process. Is that clear enough, Chris?
Will you send that to me, Zachariah?
Yeah.
Do you feel like that's still?
How about this? Can I run it by Jay Lynn once in written text, and then we'll get it off to Chris?
Yes.
Is that good enough for a motion?
Yeah, is there a second? Or, sorry, Evan.
Yeah. Seconded by Mary McGann. Further discussion.
What I'm seeing here is that e-bikes are on their way to become full-fledged motorcycles, just with an electronic engine. That's where I'm seeing this going right now. Because what happened between bicycles and motorcycles in the early part of the 20th century is exactly what we're seeing now. Okay? So this is going to go to full-fledged motorcycle that's basically got an electric engine. Okay? So, yeah, I think we need to determine something right now that we need to have areas restricted to human power.
And that's what we're going for, non-motorized.
So, the only thing I would suggest we leave in is preserve its current policy with, current policy which does not permit e-bikes while, I mean,
Yeah. While
while doing the rest of it.
evaluating.
But I just think it's important to have that, which does not currently permit e-bike use, because, that statement tells everybody that e-bikes aren't allowed right now.
Great.
So that's mine.
Because once you open the door, you're not going to close it.
That's mine.
You're never going to be able to close it.
I mean, we're basically gonna end up with the original motion, so go ahead and vote this down, people, but we'll vote on it. Cause you've all made me see the light.
Do you want to withdraw your motion?
Can I do that still?
No?
All those in favor for the substitute motion?
I'll just say.
Oh. All those opposed? Motion fails, with Clapper, Morse, and McGann in opposition. And we have an original motion on the table. And we've had lots of discussion. I would like to disclose that I am a special recreation permit holder with the Moab BLM, which includes mountain biking as an activity. Any other discussion or disclosures?
Do I need to disclose that I ride mountain bikes?
You just did. There you go. Any further discussion on the original motion of approving the red line letter as presented at the beginning of the meeting? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Motion passes 4-0 with, or 4-1 with Hawks in opposition.
Okay.
All right.
Could I take 10 seconds to say that the future of the e-bike is, could be just like the president of the mountain bike in Grant County, could be well known for it as a separate parallel set of trails.
Sounds like you just did. I actually have a prior commitment that I am running late to. Terry, can I pass you the floor? Thank you. So I will leave the meeting at 12:23.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the next item on the agenda is item number C, approving final decisions for the 2019 Board of Equalization Appeals. Chris?
All right. Every year, after the assessor assesses everybody's property values, there's an opportunity for property owners to submit an appeal to the Board of Equalization. The Grant County Council serves as the official Board of Equalization. However, we hire a hearing officer that specializes in evaluating these appeals. And so within your packet, there's a tax roll log that shows all of the properties that the hearing officer recommended making changes toward their value as a result of the appeal. And so what I'm presenting to you for approval are the hearing officer's recommendations for reductions in value from that assessed as determined by the hearing officer. Any questions there?
I move to approve the proposed Board of Equalization hearing officer recommendations resulting from taxpayer valuation appeals during the 2019 Board of Equalization hearings and authorize the chair to sign all associated documents.
Second by Mary. Any discussion on this motion? Hearing none. All those in favor? Aye. Item number D, approving midterm vacancy notice for the County Council District 1 seat. Christine Salone.
You do have a memo in your red folders. I don't think we need to go in a closed session to discuss it, but certainly if you guys want a motion for that, that is your right to do so. But in my opinion, the process for handling Terry's resignation is that the council must appoint someone, a person, to fill the vacancy until the next general election. So since Terry served less than 2 years of his term, his seat technically does need to go back to an election of the voters at the next general election, so that's November 2020. And in the interim, the council shall appoint a replacement. Based on our plan and form of government, that will be an unaffiliated person who files declaration of candidacy notices with us, applications, and you guys will get to pick from those individuals. Per the statute, we need to publish notice of the vacancy asking for the declarations of candidacy, and the council must direct Chris Baird to do so, our clerk auditor. So that, unfortunately, I don't have the agenda summary in front of me, and my computer is gone now, but hopefully the language that I gave you on the agenda summary is approving the midterm vacancy notice, but we also need some language in there that directs Chris Baird to publish it. Okay, great, thank you.
So Mary?
I move to approve the midterm vacancy notice to Grant County Council District 1 seat and direct the clerk auditor to publish that notice in the time and authorize the chair to sign all such.
Do I have a second? Second for you. Second. Okay. Discussion?
Yeah,
We're finishing the council meeting.
so,
What's done?
so this is a 2-week period, and does that coincide with the time when we are meeting anyway to go ahead and appoint him by this?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Krista. The appointment does need to happen within a 5-day period, so the period for the applications, it would be November 1 through 15, and then we have a November 19th, 17th, 19th? Okay.
Whatever it
Yes,
is, yeah.
so yes.
Within that time frame.
Works, but we will need to make it happen on the 19th, so we'll need you guys to, look for those applications and spend some time on them. It is a district seat, so we'll have limited applications, is my guess.
Do they, will they know how to
Well, they'll come into the office, as directed by the notice that we drafted. And then I think what we'll do is we'll just revise a declaration of candidacy to remove the petition portion. And so it'll be similar to what a candidate would normally file without the petition part. And then they would have to sign a certification that they've been a registered voter in Grand County for a year, which is a requirement, as well as living within the district.
Any other discussion? All in favor? Aye. Aye. No public hearings, any future considerations? Seeing none, closed sessions not necessary, so we will adjourn this meeting at 12:27. Outstanding. Thank you, everybody.
What is that? I wasn't sure.
What's the next meeting?
Next meeting is
29.
6.
Yeah.
Oh, I see the sheriff and Bill Jackson.
I presented my constitutional argument for this trial. Kind of overwhelming. In particular, Jan made some statements. Limitation on setting up the numbers to be
One of those. All right. I thought I was going to slide out. No way. All right. Thank you all.
You just didn't see Steve question. I should finish. How are you, Jaden?
As I left, I got a call from John, Congressman Curtis's office, and they've been called into a meeting to discuss, I'm not sure who with, they didn't say, but they're going to be discussing the capacity, how much, if funds weren't a consideration, how much could they increase the productivity of the UMTR project to enable it to get done? So it would be something if they came through and gave us the same amount of money as we got through the TAR, we could have this done in 3 years. I don't know if it's gonna happen, but that's why I left, and that's what they're talking about, is what, it would be going back to 2 shifts a day. It would be a lot, but we did that during the TAR in 2009 and 10, we were double what we're moving now. Wow.
We'll see, I guess, how it progresses.
That's why anytime I see Jade's name on my phone,
There's still a boundary issue.
He doesn't help the chit chat.
oh,
screaming?
Zachariah,
Let me know what happens.
We'll keep you well informed.
Keep me well informed.
Did you get all that other documentation you were talking about a week ago? Okay, I just want to make sure you got it.
If I have a thing, I'll ask you to resend.
Okay, okay. Oh, man, they turned the lights on.